Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
I always knew my parents had been saving money for my college education, or at least that's what they had told me ever since I was old enough to understand the importance of having a future. They weren't rich, not even close, but they always emphasized how important it was to be responsible with money, to plan ahead, to invest in education because that was the only way to get ahead in life. So, I worked hard in high school, studied late into the night, skipped parties, and kept my grades up because I believed I had something waiting for me at the end of it all. Then, one evening, as I was heading to the kitchen to grab a snack, I heard my mother whispering to my father in the living room, her voice tight and urgent. I wasn't the type to eavesdrop, but something about the way she said, "We don't have a choice, it's for the family," made me stop in my tracks. I stood just outside the doorway, my breath shallow, straining to hear what they were talking about. "We'll pay her back somehow," my father said, his voice quieter than usual, like he was ashamed to say it out loud. "She'll understand," my mother replied, but she didn't sound convinced, and something in my stomach twisted painfully. "This is Matt's wedding, and he needs this," my father added, his tone now final, as if that was the only thing that mattered. I felt a chill creep up my spine as the realization hit me all at once, like a punch to the gut. They were talking about my college fund. The money they had promised me, the money that was supposed to be my safety net, my key to a better life, was about to be handed over to my brother so he could have some ridiculous, extravagant wedding. I wanted to believe I had misunderstood, that they were talking about something else, anything else, but deep down, I already knew the truth. I stepped into the living room, my voice shaking despite my best efforts to sound calm. "What do you mean, you'll pay me back?" My mother's head snapped up, her face pale, like a child caught stealing from a cookie jar. My father sighed heavily, rubbing his forehead as if I was just another problem he didn't want to deal with. "Sarah, sweetheart, this isn't what you think," my mother started, but I cut her off before she could spin another lie. "You took my college fund," I said, forcing the words out even though my throat felt tight. "You gave it to Matt?" My father exhaled sharply, already irritated. "It's not like that," he said, waving his hand as if the conversation was beneath him. "We're just borrowing it. We'll figure something out for you later." I stared at them, my own parents, the people who had raised me, the people I had trusted, and I realized they weren't ashamed of what they had done. They weren't even sorry. In their minds, Matt's wedding was simply more important than my education, and that was that. "You'll figure something out?" I repeated, my voice breaking. "That money was for college. You promised me." My mother sighed as if she was the victim in all of this. "Honey, Matt and Jessica need this wedding to be special. You know how hard he's worked, and I haven't." I shot back, my hands clenched into fists. "I've spent years working my ass off to get into a good school, and you just enough, Sarah," my father said sharply, his tone final, like he was done pretending to care about how I felt. "We made a decision, and you're just going to have to be patient. We'll help you later." Something inside me cracked at that moment, something that couldn't be put back together. It wasn't just about the money, it was about the fact that they had never even considered how this would affect me. They had never once thought that maybe, just maybe, their daughter deserved the same support they were giving their golden boy. I wanted to scream, to throw something, to make them understand what they had done, but I knew it wouldn't change anything. They had already decided I didn't matter as much as Matt. I forced myself to breathe, swallowing down the lump in my throat. "Fine," I said, my voice cold, my body numb. "Do whatever you want." I turned and walked away before they could say another word, before my mother could try to justify it, before my father could tell me to stop being selfish. I went to my room, closed the door, and sat on my bed, staring at the wall, feeling the weight of betrayal settle in my chest like a stone. The wedding was everything they wanted it to be. A lavish, over-the-top display of wealth they didn't have, a designer wedding dress for Jessica, an open bar, $1,000 cake, and a honeymoon in Greece. I sat at the cheap kids' table in the corner of the ballroom, watching as my parents beamed with pride at Matt, their perfect son, their chosen one. Not once did they look my way. Not once did they think about what they had taken from me. I smiled, but it wasn't real. Let them enjoy it while they can. Because one day, they were going to regret this. The years that followed were nothing like I had imagined when I was a teenager, dreaming of stepping onto a college campus with the confidence that my future was secure. Instead of moving into a dorm, making new friends, and focusing solely on my education, I found myself working 2 part-time jobs just to afford the classes I could barely squeeze into my schedule. Community college became my only option, not because I lacked ambition or intelligence, but because my parents had made it abundantly clear that my future simply wasn't as important as my brother Matt's wedding. At first, I held on to hope that they would make good on their promise, that they would somehow come through for me the way they had come through for him. Every time I asked, my mother would sigh dramatically and say something vague about needing to sort things out or figure out the finances, while my father would wave me off with a dismissive grunt, as though my very existence was an inconvenience. It became a routine, me asking, them avoiding, and Matt continuing to live a life that should have been impossible on his salary alone. The thing that stung the most wasn't just the money they had taken from me, but the way they continued to give freely to Matt without hesitation. I watched as they gifted him and his new wife Jessica a down payment for a house that was twice the size of anything they had ever lived in themselves, beaming with pride as though his success was a direct reflection of their parenting. I watched as they handed him the keys to a brand new SUV, saying something about how a growing family needs reliable transportation, even though there wasn't a baby on the way yet. I watched as they took them out for expensive dinners, paid for lavish vacations, and never once seemed to question whether Matt should be responsible for himself the way I was expected to be. The resentment simmered beneath my skin like an infection I couldn't shake, but I kept my mouth shut and forced a smile whenever they made some half-hearted excuse about why they couldn't help me right now. I learned to stop asking, to stop hoping, to stop waiting for them to do the right thing. Instead, I worked harder, stretching myself thin between school and jobs, barely sleeping, barely scraping by, but refusing to give up completely. Then, one night, after years of hearing nothing but excuses, I decided I was done playing along with their lies. I was home for dinner, something that happened less and less often now that I had started to distance myself, and the conversation, as always, revolved around Matt and Jessica. My mother was gushing about the new furniture they had picked out for their nursery, despite the fact that Jessica wasn't even pregnant yet, while my father nodded along like it was the most important thing in the world. I let them talk, let them celebrate their golden child, let them revel in the joy of spending money they claimed not to have, until finally, I had heard enough. I set my fork down carefully, straightened my shoulders, and looked my mother dead in the eye. So, when exactly am I getting the help you promised? The room went silent. My mother blinked, caught off guard by the directness of my question, while my father sighed as though he had been dreading this moment for years. Sarah, honey, my mother began, her voice laced with fake sympathy, it's just been a tough few years, you know that. I didn't flinch. Tough for who? She hesitated, glancing at my father for support, but he only grunted and reached for his beer like he wanted nothing to do with this conversation. Look, sweetheart, she tried again, softer this time, as though she thought gentle words would lessen the blow. It's gone. There's nothing left. For a moment, I just stared at her, waiting for her to laugh, to say she was joking, to offer some kind of solution, but nothing came. She just sat there, looking at me with what I could only describe as mild discomfort, like she was hoping I wouldn't make a scene. It's gone, I repeated, my voice strangely calm despite the rage bubbling beneath the surface. She nodded, pushing food around on her plate, avoiding my gaze. We had to use it, Sarah. There were things we needed to take care of, and like a wedding. I interrupted, my eyes locked onto hers, daring her to lie to me again. She exhaled heavily, setting her fork down as if she was exhausted by my persistence. Matt needed help, and we did what we had to do. I turned to my father, waiting to see if he would step in, if he would defend their actions, if he would show even the slightest bit of regret, but all he did was shrug. It's just money, Sarah, he said, finally meeting my gaze. You'll figure things out. You always do. That was the moment something inside me shifted permanently. The last remaining sliver of hope I had held on to, the the tiny part of me that still wanted to believe they cared about my future died right then and there. They weren't sorry. They didn't regret it. They didn't even see it as something worth apologizing for. I forced myself to smile, nodding like I understood, like I was the same naive daughter they had always known, like I wasn't already planning my next move. "You're right," I said, my voice smooth and even. "I'll figure things out." They seemed relieved by my acceptance, eager to move past the conversation, eager to get back to talking about Matt. They had no idea that I had just decided, in that very moment, that they would never know anything real about my life ever again. I would work harder. I would make something of myself. I would succeed despite them. And when the time was right, they would find out exactly what it felt like to be left behind. I learned quickly that no one was going to come to my rescue, no one was going to fix the damage my parents had done, and no one was going to make sure I had the future I had once been promised. The only person I could rely on was myself, and once I accepted that truth, something inside me hardened, something that made me more determined than I had ever been before. I stopped waiting for apologies that would never come, stopped hoping for fairness from people who had already proven they didn't believe I deserved it, and instead, I focused on one thing and one thing only: winning the long game. I threw myself into work, juggling side gigs, late-night shifts, and anything that would bring an extra income while I continued to push through my classes. I studied financial strategies in my spare time, obsessing over books and articles about investments, real estate, and wealth building, determined to learn everything my parents had never bothered to teach me. While other people my age were out enjoying themselves, blowing their paychecks on vacations, drinks, and designer clothes, I was working, saving, and planning, slowly and methodically setting the foundation for something bigger. The best part was that I never let on that I was making real money, never gave my parents any reason to suspect that I was doing anything other than barely scraping by. They still saw me as the struggling daughter who was figuring things out, still assumed that because I wasn't flaunting my success the way Matt did, I must not have any to begin with. It worked in my favor, allowing me to stay under their radar while I built something they would never see coming. Meanwhile, Matt continued living his life as if the world revolved around him, his every need still being met without question, his every whim indulged by the same parents who had once told me there was nothing left for my education. I watched as they showered him with gifts, from home renovations to expensive vacations, all while making subtle comments about how I should be more understanding about the choices they had made. They spoke as if their betrayal was something I should have already moved past, as if I should be grateful just to have their love, as if love alone could pay my rent or erase the years of struggle I had endured alone. One day, while visiting my parents for dinner, Matt leaned back in his chair and casually mentioned that they had been concerned about me still renting instead of owning a home. I could tell by the smug look on his face that he enjoyed the idea of me being perceived as less successful, enjoyed the thought that I was still years behind him in terms of stability and financial security. "You know," he said, swirling his drink like he was about to impart some great wisdom, "you really should have worked harder, like me. That's why Mom and Dad helped me out, because they saw that I was responsible and had my life together." I had to fight the urge to laugh at the absurdity of his words, had to stop myself from pointing out the mountain of privilege he stood on every time he dared to speak about working hard. Instead, I smiled, the kind of smile that hid everything beneath the surface, the kind of smile that let him think he had won when in reality, he had no idea what was coming. "That's great advice, Matt," I said smoothly, lifting my glass to my lips, pretending to consider his words. "I'll keep that in mind." He smirked, satisfied, and my parents exchanged relieved glances, as if they believed I was finally accepting my place in the family hierarchy. None of them suspected that just days before, I had quietly signed the paperwork to purchase my first home, a property that was more valuable than anything Matt had ever owned, something I had secured entirely on my own. I had spent years listening to them tell me I needed to be patient, that I needed to wait my turn, that things would eventually work out for me if I just stayed, understanding about the sacrifices they had made. But the truth was, I was done waiting. I was done playing by their rules, done pretending that I hadn't figured out the game they had rigged against me from the start. I had worked for every single penny, had built something real while they had continued throwing money at Matt as if he were the only child worth investing in. They had spent so much time assuming I was struggling that they never once thought to question what I was really doing, never considered that maybe, just maybe, I had surpassed them all while they were too busy patting themselves on the back for helping their golden son. I let them keep their illusions a little while longer, let them continue believing that I was still the daughter who needed their pity, needed their guidance, needed their validation. But the truth was, the first step of my revenge had already been set in motion, and they wouldn't see it coming until it was far too late to change a thing. The invitation I sent out was worded casually, phrased in a way that made it seem as though this gathering was nothing more than a small, informal get-together, a simple housewarming in celebration of finally having a place of my own. I knew exactly what my parents and Matt would assume, knew they would picture a modest little rental somewhere in the suburbs, maybe a small apartment or a tiny starter home, something just barely within my means, something unimpressive, something that reaffirmed their long-held belief that I had never quite measured up to Matt. They had spent years underestimating me, years assuming that because I hadn't flaunted my success the way Matt did, I must not have any to begin with. So I let them believe what they wanted, let them walk into my trap with the same arrogance and entitlement they had always carried, never suspecting for a second that they were about to be blindsided in a way they would never forget. The day of the housewarming, I stood by the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of my brand-new home, sipping a glass of wine as I watched my parents' car pull into the long, winding driveway. I could already imagine the way my mother's brows would knit together in confusion, the way my father would glance around uneasily, trying to piece together a reality that didn't match what they had convinced themselves was true. I had spent years waiting for this moment, years working in silence while they lavished Matt with gifts and empty praise, years letting them believe I was barely scraping by while I quietly built something they could never take from me. When the doorbell rang, I took my time answering, letting them stand outside for a few extra seconds, letting the anticipation build just a little longer before finally pulling open the massive double doors that led into the grand foyer. My mother was the first to step inside, her eyes immediately darting around the space, scanning every inch of the high ceilings, the elegant lighting, the sleek hardwood floors that stretched from one room to the next. My father followed closely behind, his mouth slightly open as he took in the sheer size of the place, his usual smug expression replaced with something I could only describe as disbelief. Matt and Jessica were the last to enter, their footsteps hesitant, their eyes wide, their entire demeanor shifting as they realized this wasn't what they had expected at all. "Sarah," my mother finally said, her voice thin and uncertain as she turned to face me. This is your place?" I took another slow sip of my wine, savoring the moment, watching as the reality of the situation settled onto their shoulders like a weight they didn't quite know how to carry. "It is," I said simply, my tone light, as if this was just another ordinary day, as if their reactions weren't the exact thing I had been waiting years to see. Matt let out a short, awkward laugh, shaking his head as if trying to dismiss the tension in the air. "No way," he said, still grinning, though there was something forced about it now. "Come on, you're renting this place, right?" I turned to look at him, raising an eyebrow as I tilted my head slightly, pretending to consider his words before finally giving a small shrug. "Nope," I said, my voice calm, my expression unreadable. "Bought it. It's mine." The silence that followed was almost comical, stretched long and thick as they all stood there, struggling to process what I had just told them. My father was the first to break, clearing his throat as he adjusted the cuffs of his sleeves, his movements stiff, his face unreadable. "Wait," he said slowly, his voice laced with something between discomfort and disbelief. "How could you afford this?" I met his gaze without flinching, my fingers tracing the rim of my wine glass, my posture relaxed as I let the words hang in the air for just a second too long. I wanted them to sit with their confusion, wanted them to wrestle with their own assumptions, wanted them to feel the weight of the truth pressing down on them before I finally answered. "Oh, I said casually, my lips curling into a small, knowing smile. "I worked for it." Since there was nothing left to help me. My mother's face went pale, her lips parting slightly as if she wanted to say something but couldn't quite find the words. My father shifted uncomfortably, glancing away as if the sight of me standing there, completely self-made, was something he didn't quite know how to handle. Matt's smile had completely disappeared now, replaced with a tight-lipped expression that made it clear he was struggling to process the fact that the sister he had spent years looking down on had just outdone him in a way he never saw coming. Jessica was the only one who attempted to recover, forcing a bright, artificial smile as she stepped forward, her voice dripping with false enthusiasm. "Wow, Sarah, this is incredible," she said, though the strained look in her eyes told me exactly how she really felt. "I mean, I had no idea you were doing so well." I let out a soft chuckle, shaking my head slightly as I swirled my wine in my glass. "Yeah," I said smoothly, my voice steady, my expression unwavering. "I guess no one ever thought to ask." The tension in the room was so thick it was almost suffocating, the air heavy with unspoken realizations, with the weight of every past conversation where they had dismissed me, belittled me, acted as though I was nothing more than a struggling afterthought. They had spent years assuming I needed their help, assuming I was failing, assuming I was just biding my time until they finally decided to throw me a bone. But now, standing in the middle of a home that was bigger, more modern, and more valuable than anything they had ever owned, they were realizing the truth in real time. My father exhaled sharply, his jaw tightening as he finally looked at me, his expression unreadable, but his voice low and controlled. "You should have told us," he muttered, his words slow, deliberate, as if he was trying to regain some sense of authority over a situation that had completely slipped through his fingers. I held his gaze for a long moment, letting him see the amusement in my eyes, letting him feel the weight of his own words before I simply shrugged, offering him the same dismissive response he had given me all those years ago. "Why?" I asked, my voice smooth and unwavering. "You never told me when my future disappeared." His lips pressed into a thin line, my mother's eyes darted to the floor, Matt shifted uncomfortably, and for the first time in my life, I realized something undeniable: I had won. The silence that filled the room was almost deafening, stretching between us like an invisible force, pressing down on the air, making every glance, every swallowed breath, every nervous shift of weight unbearably loud in the absence of words. My father stood with his arms crossed, his expression carefully neutral, but I could see the muscle twitching in his jaw, the telltale sign of a man trying to reconcile the reality in front of him with the version of events he had convinced himself was true. My mother kept glancing between me and the house itself, her wide eyes filled with something that was meant to resemble pride, but was tainted with something far less noble: envy, regret, disbelief, maybe even shame. Matt, who had always been the golden child, the one they built their lives around, the one they had sacrificed for without hesitation, stood awkwardly near the fireplace, pretending to admire the decor, his fingers tapping against the sleeve of his expensive designer shirt. He had always been good at pretending he was unfazed by things, always carried himself with an air of confidence so thick it could almost be mistaken for genuine security, but I saw through it now. I saw the way he kept darting his eyes toward my parents, as if searching for some unspoken reassurance that he was still the favorite, that he still mattered more, that this unexpected shift in the balance of power wasn't really happening. I didn't say anything as I watched them struggle to process the truth, didn't rush to fill the silence or ease their discomfort, didn't feel the need to explain myself or justify how I had gotten here. For years, I had been the one waiting, the one listening, the one hoping for scraps of approval from people who had never truly valued me the way they had valued him. But now, standing in this house that I had built for myself, surrounded by the proof of my own resilience, I realized something that made the victory even sweeter. I didn't need their approval. I didn't need their pride, their validation, their recognition, because I had done this without them, had done what they never believed I was capable of, had created a life that was bigger and better than anything they had ever planned for me. Matt let out a forced chuckle, breaking the tension with the kind of poorly timed joke that people tell when they don't know what else to do, when they feel control slipping through their fingers and need to grasp at something, anything, to regain their footing. "Man, Sarah," he said, shaking his head with a crooked grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. Guess I should have taken some financial advice from you, huh? I tilted my head slightly, watching him, watching the way he tried to act like this was all just some funny little surprise, as if he wasn't rattled by the fact that his little sister, the one they had all dismissed, the one they had left to fend for herself, had just outshined him in a way that no amount of their favoritism could erase. Yeah, I said, my voice light but firm, letting the weight of the moment settle over him. Guess you should have. My mother clapped her hands together, forcing a smile onto her face, the kind of expression people wear when they're trying to pretend everything is fine, when they're desperately trying to reclaim a sense of control over a situation that has spiraled beyond their grasp. Well, sweetheart, she said, her voice overly cheerful, I have to say. This place is truly amazing. We're so proud of you. I didn't miss the slight hesitation before the word proud, didn't miss the way her fingers twitched against the hem of her blouse, didn't miss the way my father remained silent, his lips pressed together so tightly that they had turned pale. I could tell she wanted me to respond in kind, wanted me to bask in their praise, wanted me to thank them for the empty compliment as if it erased the years of neglect, as if it made up for every time they had told me there was nothing left for me. For every moment they had made me feel like I was worth less than my brother. Instead, I just smiled, nodding slightly, letting them wonder what I was thinking, letting them sit with their own discomfort for once. They expected an invitation to dinner, expected me to welcome them in further, expected to be rewarded for finally acknowledging my success as if it was some generous gift they were bestowing upon me. I saw it in the way my mother's gaze flicked toward the dining room, in the way my father shifted slightly, in the way Matt's forced grin started to relax as he assumed that, despite everything, he would always be the one in control of the family dynamic. But instead of leading them further into my home, instead of pulling out chairs and pouring wine and pretending that we were just another happy family sitting down for a meal together, I turned toward the entryway, stepping toward the coat rack, my movements slow and deliberate. I reached for their jackets, gathered them in my arms, and held them out, my expression carefully blank as I met their confused stares. Oh, I said, my tone light, I have plans tonight. This was just a quick tour. But hey, hope you guys enjoyed the visit. The shift in their faces was immediate, the confusion giving way to something that almost looked like panic, like they hadn't actually considered the possibility that I wouldn't let them linger, wouldn't let them soak in my success like they had any part in it, wouldn't let them stay in my space like they still had any power over me. My mother blinked rapidly, her smile faltering, her hands reaching for her coat as if she wasn't entirely sure what was happening. My father let out a short breath, his shoulders tensing, his brows knitting together in something that almost resembled regret, but didn't quite make it past his pride. Matt just stood there, his mouth slightly open, as if he wanted to protest, as if he wanted to remind me of some unspoken rule that had always existed between us, the rule that had ensured he was always taken care of first, the rule that had convinced him he would always be more important in their eyes. But I didn't offer him an explanation. I didn't give him, or any of them, the satisfaction of knowing what I was thinking. I walked them to the door, held it open, and watched as they stepped out onto the porch, their movements slow, their expressions unsettled, their once unwavering confidence visibly shaken. As the door clicked shut behind them, I exhaled, leaning back against the smooth wood, letting the moment sink in, letting the weight of it settle deep into my bones. Revenge didn't always need to be loud. Sometimes, it was just standing back and watching as the people who underestimated you finally realized they had lost.